Introduction: The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Lao Tzu. How can this book help you? Welcome to the wonderful world of Kaizen. This is usually the part where the author makes bold claims about how their book is going to instantly transform your life. This isn't to say that this book won't transform your life. It very much has the potential to do so. But I'm afraid that it won't do it by itself. It will, however, tool you up with useful tips and advice on how to interrogate your existing behavior, help you understand why you abandon certain new habits or lose motivation halfway through, look at how to break free from bad habits, teach you how to keep track of your progress, and remind you to practice self-compassion along the way. The quote from the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu is one often used in self-help books and on motivational screensavers, but it is one that is popular for a reason and perfectly encapsulates the Kaizen philosophy. You can change your life by making lots of small steps. This book is for anybody who is interested in Japan or, more broadly, Eastern philosophies, anybody who has tried to take up a new habit or behavior in the past but struggled to keep going when life got in the way, anybody looking to refine or change their existing behaviors, anybody who senses that they could be improving a certain aspect of their life but isn't sure where to start, anybody who has found that other self-help techniques haven't worked for them and is looking for a method that they can mold to their own preferences and behaviors, playing to their strengths and minimizing their weaknesses. You can tailor Kaizen to your own needs. You can choose to do it at your own pace and work towards your own goals, not anybody else's. In doing so, you have the potential to overhaul your current habits, acquire new skills and knowledge, and abandon unproductive behaviors. The roots of Kaizen. Kaizen is a noun in Japanese and is used to mean improvement, whether that is big or small, one-time or continuous. It is also sometimes used in relation to martial arts, where the idea of improving one area of your practice meticulously and slowly is encouraged. You are prompted to focus on one thing at a time, simply, and to practice until you get results. You could see the philosophy of Kaizen as very much East meets West, in that the business theory was actually conceived by the US government, but then brought over and used to great effect in post-World War II Japan, where the economy had been completely destroyed by the war effort. Kaizen is credited with influencing the huge success of Japanese companies in the second half of the 20th century and has since been popularized around the world as an effective method for improving existing habits and achieving success in a number of different fields, from healthcare to psychotherapy to government institutions. A lot of other Japanese terms that have been adopted in the West, ikigai, wabi-sabi, shinrin-yoku, can be hard to translate directly, but the beauty of Kaizen as an improvement philosophy is that it has developed organically as a theory between the West and East. Consequently, Kaizen is not too difficult to grasp or apply to your own life. Little has been written about how an individual can apply the principles of Kaizen to aspects of their own life to bring about their own good change, but it is easy to adopt Kaizen and bring about lasting change in multiple areas of your life, from obvious things which people often try to improve, such as their health and finances, to inspiring more unusual change, whether that is learning how to speak Thai or becoming an expert at life drawing. It is a flexible and easily adaptable approach to change, rather than being dictated to by a fitness guru with unobtainable abs or a hypnotist who fails to make you stop smoking in 5 days. Kaizen encourages you to formulate your own goals and work towards them at your own pace. You make it work for you. The Kaizen philosophy assumes that our way of life, be it our working life, our social life, or our home life, deserves to be constantly improved. 3. Mr. Masaki Imai. The History of Kaizen. The idea of continuous improvement was first trialed in the States during the Second World War, when it was found that businesses were struggling to innovate and keep up with supplies for the war effort when so many men were abroad fighting the war. As such, the U.S. government created a series of programs called Training Within Industries, which aimed to stimulate business. The emphasis was put on the existing workforce to pay attention to working practices and suggest methods for improvement themselves, rather than waiting to be dictated to from above. These programs were judged a huge success and ensured that businesses could supply reliable equipment to the men abroad, while also keeping the domestic side of things afloat for when the war was over. A lot of these American businesses found that they had been bolstered by the war effort and no longer needed to rely on the programs for continuous improvement. Japan, on the other hand, was completely on its knees from the loss of life at the end of the war. Its industries were decimated and morale was low. The U.S., interested in strengthening Japan so that it could act as a buffer to North Korea, sent over a team of advisors, led by a William Edwards Deming, to provide management training courses to Japanese businesses. 5. The Japanese were immediately enthralled with this new management technique of continuous improvement and christened it Kaizen, the already common noun in Japanese used to mean good change or improvement. Businesses took to Kaizen with gusto, and it was credited with helping the huge growth of the Japanese economy. and the success of its businesses in the second half of the 20th century. Most famously, it was used by Toyota to improve its production line, labeled the Toyota Way. The emphasis was on finding lean processes, reducing production waste, increasing the quality of products, and encouraging workers to make suggestions as to how practices could be improved. Rather ironically, by the 1980s, American businesses had become nervous about Japanese companies competing with them. So Kaizen returned to the U.S. as an organizational theory. 6. It was popularized in the West by Mr. Masaaki Imai, a Japanese business consultant and organizational theorist, whose teachings are still very much used by businesses around the world today. Kaizen as an organizational theory. Mr. Masaaki Imai first popularized the theory of Kaizen in his book Kaizen, The Key to Japan's Competitive Success. In the book, he describes the differences he has seen between Japanese and Western working practices, and from this advocates the idea that Kaizen is an extension of the Japanese value system and its incremental attitude towards change. I came to the conclusion that the key difference between how change is understood in Japan and how it is viewed in the West lies in the Kaizen concept, a concept that is so natural and obvious to many Japanese managers that they often do not even realize that they possess. 7. Mr. Imai noted how gradual change was a less obvious part of the Western way of life than it was in Japan, and that Western businesses were less successful because they always sought abrupt and dramatic change over incremental change. It is now more than 30 years since the release of Mr. Imai's book, and his Kaizen Institute continues to consult for and train businesses in the philosophy of Kaizen. At first, they worked exclusively with car companies, but the Institute has since expanded across the world. They now work with lots of other sectors, from banking to retail to government organizations. Mr. Imai's colleague Euclides Coimbra, senior partner and managing director of the Kaizen Institute Western Europe, spoke to me about the Institute and how the theory of Kaizen can be applied to individual change as well as organizational change. In his book, Mr. Imai stresses that Kaizen should be applied to every part of an organization, and Coimbra advocates this universal approach to change. We believe that the only way to have a continuous improvement culture is to practice improvements engaging everybody, everywhere and every day. Continuous improvement involves everyone, whether you are a junior worker or a senior manager. The workers at the top of the organization are encouraged to come up with short, medium, and long-term goals for the business around 4 criteria: growth, quality, level of service, and motivation. Every employee, whether that is the person on the reception desk, a till worker, or the foreman on the factory floor, is invited to also make suggestions on how to improve. The employees make suggestions in groups and as individuals, and the emphasis is on very small things that would transform their working process. At the time of Imai's book release, Japanese workers each made 19 suggestions per year on average for ways in which their companies could improve, and this level of engagement is still very much encouraged today. Success for the company is judged on whether it is more productive, more competitive, and more profitable, but the emphasis is on long-term incremental improvements rather than quick and drastic change. Kaizen for personal development. Kaizen techniques can work outside of organizational theory, and Mr. Imai himself acknowledges that the philosophy has wider applications than just the business world, particularly as, in his view, all individuals have an instinctive desire to improve themselves. Coimbra asserts that at the Kaizen Institute they very much encourage that. Since we started the Kaizen Institute, we have been applying what we preach internally. We have a course for our employees where we teach Kaizen principles and tools for personal development. This optional course encourages participants to assess their lives against a number of criteria and to make suggestions for changes. Participants work on a plan involving small actions they can make to bring about improvement. This eventually becomes a life strategy, in which they are asked to summarize the changes that they are going to make on an A3 piece of paper, which mirrors the same strategy document that businesses such as Toyota use when they are formulating their Kaizen strategy. Coimbra says that when people start their own Kaizen practice, most of the habits they are looking to change are physical, such as exercise, sleep, and diet. But once employees try new habits, they are encouraged to work towards more emotional aspects of improvement. Coimbra states that it is common to see people adopting meditation habits and being more conscious of their own emotion and the impact they may have in the emotions of other people. The employees who have signed up to the program have noticed considerable improvements in their habits and happiness, including better exercise habits, rest, and nutrition, and have demonstrated more sophisticated behaviors related to emotional intelligence and spiritual engagement in life as a whole. Coimbra asserts our most motivated employees have the Kaizen mindset in their personal life, and this of course benefits all aspects of their life. Change is infectious, and when success is achieved in one area, you are encouraged to apply the same techniques to another area of your life. This is referred to as Yakoten or horizontal deployment, i.e., copying what works in one area to see if it works in another. The philosophy of Kaizen is just as easy to apply to individual change as to change in a business. It is about setting long-term, medium-term, and short-term goals, then thinking of small, incremental adjustments you can make to work towards these goals. Coimbra argues that if you adopt the philosophy of continuous improvement, you will always be looking for ways to do better, even if it is only improving small things on a daily basis. We can see that the long-term evolution of our society as human beings is one of continuous progress, and that if we create a spiral of continuous wins, we will be much better in all senses. Over the course of this book, as well as introducing you to Kaizen techniques and offering tips for small steps you can make to change your environment and routine in a number of areas, I will encourage you to adopt this philosophy of continuous improvement through taking a step back and analyzing your life as a whole. I hope that it will help you to see it from a different perspective. Whether that's choosing to embrace nature, eating more mindfully, or thinking about your career goals. And once one small change makes a difference, it is likely that you will practice your own Yakoten and be encouraged to try another change. Kaizen and sport. The field of sport is another area in which Kaizen techniques have already been used successfully, as well as it being used in martial arts training. Several top sports teams have cited Kaizen, or marginal gains as it is sometimes referred to, as a technique that they have used to great effect. Sir Dave Brailsford became head of the British cycling team in 2002, when the existing team had experienced little to no success. But by the Beijing Olympics in 2008, the team won 7 of the 10 possible gold medals for cycling, and achieved the same tally at the London Olympics in 2012. Brailsford, who had an MBA and an interest in business management techniques, started to use Kaizen as a way to improve the team's performance. He got the team to break down every aspect of cycling into as small a part as possible, whether that was the aerodynamics, the nutrition of the cyclists, the maintenance of the bikes, and then gave them a target of improving each part by just 1%. Rather than focusing on perfection from the start, he looked for marginal gains in each area and celebrated small successes, which soon became cumulative successes. He cites these marginal gains as creating a contagious enthusiasm for change, which then spurred the team on to even more success. Brailsford is now taking his techniques to members of the British government to show how they can be applied to public services, such as Britain's National Health Service, to improve targets and overall performance. Japan and the West. As we have already discussed, the continuous improvement philosophy of Kaizen is very much East meets West. It was conceived as a business strategy in the West but was then adopted by Japanese companies, who saw the techniques as an extension of Japanese values and attitudes towards incremental change. During the course of this book, I am going to explore how Kaizen is a good example of this ongoing dialogue between Japan and the West, and touch upon what we can learn from some of the other Japanese social, cultural, and philosophical traditions too. Japanese society is not without its flaws, but I think we can gain a lot from observing the way it works. One of the things that I immediately noticed when arriving in Japan is how it has retained its own sense of identity and strong social structures. You are instantly struck by small children playing out in the street unaccompanied, people leaving their bikes unlocked outside their houses and often leaving the doors to their homes unlocked, too. As a woman, it feels a lot safer to walk around at night compared to other big cities like London, Paris, or New York. There are hardly any litter bins in central Tokyo, but somehow no litter whatsoever. People take responsibility and carry it home with them. There is a really strong social contract, and it is so refreshing and inspirational to experience firsthand. Being more conscious of the needs of others around you and of your impact on your environment is something I feel we need to introduce into our lives as much as possible. Japan is dominated by a collectivist culture unlike any that we have in the West. It will take a foreigner a prolonged period of being immersed in Japanese culture to fully appreciate the amount of social rules and small daily courtesies that dominate the way that the Japanese interact with each other. The social structures are set up very distinctively and founded on rules that can sometimes seem alien to those outside of Japan. Because the inhabitable parts of the country are so densely populated, there has to be a big emphasis on social cohesion. One of the most unique aspects of Japanese culture is the concept of Uchai-soto, which dictates a lot of Japan's social customs and even extends to their language. Translating as Uchai and Soto, it is about separating in groups from out-groups. A Japanese person's in-group would be their family, close friends, and co-workers, whereas the out-group would be any clients, customers, visitors, or gaijin. When speaking with someone from an out-group, the out-group must be honored, and the in-group humbled, which means that different language is used to convey a level of politeness depending on who you are talking to. This also extends to gift-giving and other social interactions such as serving, where the customer is treated with the ultimate respect. The upside of this is the strong social contract and relative social cohesion between Japanese people and the respect and politeness that an outsider will feel when visiting Japan. The downside of these rules is that as an outsider it can be hard to be fully accepted in Japanese society. For example, my British friend has been living in Tokyo for 15 years, is fluent in Japanese and has a Japanese wife, but still feels like he isn't fully integrated into society. Younger people are said to be embracing these rules less, but they are still fundamental to Japanese society and business culture. Although there are many things in Japan that a naive Westerner will recognize, there are American coffee shops on every corner, Western-style sit-down toilets favored over traditional squat toilets, and gigantic Scandinavian fashion stores seemingly everywhere. A short time there will make you realize that, as well as there being traditional social structures, there is also still a huge emphasis on traditional Japanese craft and design. There is a definite melding of Western culture with traditional Japanese culture. You will see teenage girls dressed up in traditional kimonos, or the lighter versions, yukata, in summer, but their mates might be wearing the latest Nike trainers or a new cult skater brand. This mixing of cultures also happens in the home. I visited and lived in a number of different homes during my time in Japan, and some of them were super modern apartments with Western-style beds and sofas, while others still had futons to sleep on and retained the traditional design of tatami matting on the floor. The choice of bedding would often fit the practicalities of the space, with traditional bedding often used in smaller apartments, so that it can be folded up out of the way during the day. Many attribute Japan's distinctive social structures and emphasis on simple, beautiful design to the fact that the country was isolated for 220 years until the Meiji-era open-door policy in 1868. Prior to that, Japan was a sakoku with an isolationist foreign policy. Trade between Japan and other countries was severely limited. Japanese people were stopped from leaving the country, and almost all foreigners were barred from entry. There was some very limited trade with other countries, and some Western inventions were introduced into Japan this way, mostly via its trade with the Dutch East India Company, but, on the whole, exposure to the rest of the world for everyday Japanese people was non-existent. This meant that Japan's social structures, design and culture were allowed to flourish without any external influences. When Japan was opened up again, there was a huge flurry of interest from the West in Japanese society and culture, and a desire to influence it themselves. The Meiji Restoration period of 1868-1191 saw the dismantling of the previous governmental structures of the Edo period of 1603-1186-7, where Japan had been ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, a feudal military-style government. The Meiji period saw the establishment of a representative democracy, the foundation of the Tokyo police force based on the model used in Paris, and the introduction of Western cultural activities, such as baseball. Japanese ideas also flowed back the other way, with the French art critic Philippe Berty coining the term Japanisme in the early 1870s to describe the massive appetite for Japanese design and art in both France and elsewhere. This can be seen in the painting, sculpture, and architecture of Europe in the late 19th century, particularly the Impressionist artists. The aesthetic movement in Art Nouveau. This opening up of Japan in the 19th century started a dialogue with the rest of the world that has been continuing ever since, and it is a dialogue which has often been contentious. The American occupation of Japan between 1945 and 1952 introduced reforms that are still in place today, such as the suffrage of women and a new co-education system, but it also sped up the influence that the West was having upon Japanese society. Some have argued that the Sakoku period of isolation firmly cemented certain values and traditions that make Japan unique, but that these have been continuously under threat from the onslaught of foreign influence ever since. The dialogue between Japan and the West continues to develop and ebb and flow, and the philosophy of Kaizen can be seen as this dialogue in action. It is an idea which came to Japan from the West, but was very much aligned with the traditional Japanese attitude towards gradual change, before being eventually exported back to the West. Why is Kaizen useful now? There are a lot of problems in the world that are out of our control, but for the parts of our lives over which we can have more control, Kaizen is a great way to reduce sources of stress and bring about new, exciting improvements. While inept politicians and worries about climate change aren't going anywhere, Kaizen can be used to bring more harmony into your immediate environment and improve your well-being, so that you have more energy to face and fight the problems of the wider world. Unlike expensive gym memberships that go unused or an impulse purchase which you have forgotten about by the next day, Kaizen is free and accessible to anyone. The only thing you really need to start is a pen and paper to draw up your initial plan and track your goals. The emphasis is on making small, incremental changes to parts of your routine, which can easily fit around work, childcare, or social commitments. The changes should be so small that at first you barely notice any difference to your daily life. as the British cycling team looked to improve aspects of their process by just 1%. This is the amount of impact upon your routine you should be looking at too. It is adding one more fruit or vegetable item to your food shop or meditating for 5 minutes every Saturday morning. Once you have made one change to a habit or formed a new one, then you can decide if you wish to step up that habit or move on to changing or obtaining a different one. For example, if you have meditated every Saturday for a month and found it beneficial, then you could start including more days in your routine or meditating for slightly longer. You should find that this small feeling of success is contagious and will spur you on to achieve even more. Why do we have habits? Ben Gardner, senior lecturer in psychology at King's College London, offers a perspective on habitual behavior from the world of psychology, explaining that habitual behaviors are essential to be able to function every day. Gardner tells me that we develop habitual patterns because it is our brain's way of locking in useful responses. He describes people as cognitive misers, i.e., we like to conserve our mental resources so that we can then use those resources on other, more mindful tasks. He gives an example. If we develop a habit for example, putting a tea bag in a cup after taking the cup from the cupboard, then that becomes one less thing that we need to think about. So then, our tea making does not require us to deliberate over the next steps, but instead can proceed on autopilot, allowing us the mental space to think about other things. It is important to state that not all habits are inherently negative, as they are essential for us to be able to function on an everyday level. If we had to pay close attention to every single task that we undertake, such as walking up some stairs or drinking a sip of water, we would be constantly exhausted. What this can mean, however, is that we also turn to our bad habits for comfort and safety when we are feeling low or tired. For example, if I have had a tough day at work, I always have a strong desire to go shopping or order an unhealthy takeaway. Escaping from the safety zone of our habitual behaviors can be difficult, and, as a result, it can mean that we go about a lot of our life on autopilot or acting in ways that we know aren't good for us. Why is it so hard to change our habits? Habits are seductive and save us a lot of time and energy. So when it then comes to changing them, it can seem a scary and daunting prospect. Gardner agrees. The downside of our brains locking in behaviors becomes clear when we want to change those behaviors. Habitual behaviors can proceed even when we lack the motivation to do them. And sometimes, when we expressly do not want to do them, this can be useful where they help us over the line with good behaviors. For example, if I have formed a habit of going for a run each morning when I wake up, and one morning I wake up and feel demotivated, my habit is going to help me to ensure I go anyway, despite my lack of motivation. The flip side of this is that, if we have locked in something like smoking, then that behavior becomes very hard to change via motivational means. In other words, you may successfully change a smoker's motivation, educating them of the dangers of smoking, but if they smoke habitually, despite being motivated not to do so, then changing their motivation won't translate into changing their behavior. One initial step towards understanding how to change our habitual behaviors is to educate ourselves as to how we acquire habitual behaviors in the first place. We learn habits through repeated and rewarding performances in the presence of cues. For example, if we repeatedly bite our nails when we are in stressful situations, and we find nail biting to help us to deal with stress, then we develop an association between stress and nail biting. Each time we repeat the nail biting in response to the stress cue, so that association strengthens, to the point beyond which merely encountering the stress cue is sufficient to prompt us to enact the associated behavior automatically, without thinking about it. So, in order to try to tackle the underlying habits, we have to identify what our cues are for the unwanted behaviors. For example, work stress is a cue for me to want to go shopping. As well as being aware of the cues for certain habits, we should also be conscious of the rewards that we gain from the behavior and how these rewards can influence our desire to repeat the behavior in the future. Gardner asserts that the positive way these rewards make us feel makes getting people to change their behavior more difficult than simply educating them on the dangers of certain bad behaviors. The reason for this is because some good behaviors simply aren't rewarding enough for us. Gardner says, we don't experience such big and rapid rewards from doing as we do from some bad behaviors. The motivational system is chaotic. At any one moment, there are multiple potential wants and needs that compete to push and pull us this way and that. Often, competing desires arise at the moment when we plan to be good. It is always tempting to take the more immediately gratifying option than the more long-term reward. For those behaviors that deliver greater rewards, or more immediate rewards, it is likely to be more difficult to change these habits. Emotions and changing habits. Everybody has a friend who seems to boldly go from achieving one big goal to the next without seeming to break a sweat. They suddenly decide to quit smoking one day and never touch a cigarette again. Or they announce that they are going to do a triathlon and easily complete it without even seeming to train. There are some personality types that embrace dramatic change and can easily achieve their goals, seemingly without any self-doubt or hiccups. Let's face it, if you're not one of them, these people are incredibly annoying. But if you do struggle with change, or frequently give up on New Year's resolutions 2 weeks into January, then you are absolutely not alone. This is because the brain is programmed to react to change in a certain way. Change can be emotionally triggering, and it is a very human response to fear and resist anything that takes you out of your comfort zone, even if you know deep down that the change would benefit you. This is especially difficult if you experience a strong, if temporary, reward from carrying out the behavior. Recent psychological studies have concluded that the reason that some people find it easier to control their action and resist temptation to perform bad habits than others isn't because they have greater willpower. It is because they have found a way to make it easier to form new habits and automate their behavior to get them to their goals. The good news is that anybody can train themselves to do this, and Kaizen provides the perfect framework with which to do so. How long does change take? The statistic that is often bandied about in articles about changing your behavior is that it takes 21 days to form a habit. A study by psychologists at UCL has shown this number to be entirely fictitious. However, their findings in fact show that the amount of time that people take to reach automaticity with their habits can be anything between 18 and 254 days. The length of time to reaching automaticity varies greatly depending on the person and the habit, and there have not been enough studies done for any definitive conclusions to be drawn. There is consensus, however, that if you want to transform your habits in the long term, the new behavior is best acquired through incremental strengthening of the association between the situation in which the habit is performed and the action itself. The more that you repeat a certain habit in a certain situation, the more likely you will be able to automate it. Ben Gardner believes that drastic change to your habits can work in some situation, but that the danger of the more drastic change method is that it may be less sustainable over time. We may experience an aborted behavior change attempt as a failure, and failure can be off-putting, preventing us from wanting to try again. As the Kaizen method encourages you to change your habits in a very incremental way and to be gentle on yourself if things don't go to plan, there is less chance of you experiencing these feelings of failure. A note on negativity bias. Your brain has what is termed by psychologists as a negativity bias, stemming from the early stages of evolution where a human's survival very much depended upon their ability to perceive danger. We respond to things of a negative nature much more strongly than we do to those of a positive nature. The amygdala responds to each negative experience we have and becomes even more sensitive over time. This means that we usually overestimate threats and underestimate rewards and opportunities. This served us well when we were living in caves and potentially about to be attacked by a pack of lions. But it isn't so useful when it is crippling our creativity and driving feelings of procrastination and inertia. The status quo is a very seductive thing, while starting something new or changing an existing habit is a far scarier thought. People who can make changes to their routine easily are able to turn this feeling of fear into excitement. And you may find that there are some occasions when you, too, find that change is exciting and easy to achieve. But, on the whole, most of the time we will find the thought of change terrifying and will want to return to our secure and safe routine where there isn't the risk that we might not succeed. The good news is that negativity bias can be overcome, and using Kaizen techniques to adopt a new habit or creative challenge can be an extremely effective way of combating it.